Good day, everyone. I am Teacher Shangshang. Today, we will continue to discuss the second part of Lesson 1.2.
At the end of this lesson, you are expected to describe the two methods of sampling technique, the probability sampling technique and the non-probability sampling technique. You are also expected when and how to apply these two techniques. The two methods of sampling technique are the probability sampling technique and non-probability sampling technique. Probability sampling technique is a bit more complicated than non-probability sampling technique because it entails calculation.
In probability sampling, researchers select individuals from the population who are representative of that population, and each case being selected is known and is usually equal for all cases. When do we use probability sampling? When the population is known. And in this technique, all observations in the population have equal chances to be part in the samples. For instance, students who are officially enrolled in this semester school year 2020-2021. Since it is possible to determine the population of all students who are enrolled in this semester, probability sampling technique can be used in selecting samples. In non-probability sampling, researchers select individuals because they are available, convenient, and represent some characteristics the investigator or researcher seeks to study. The probability of each case being selected from the population is not known. When do we use non-probability sampling? When the population is not known. For example, your target subjects are students who failed the subject statistics. In this case, determining the population of those students who failed the subject is difficult. Therefore, non-probability sampling is the appropriate sampling technique in selecting samples. We will discuss four probability sampling methods. The first is the simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, the probability of being selected is known and equal for all members of the population. You can either use the blind draw method or the random numbers method. In blind draw method, all the names of your observations in the population will be placed in a hat, and then you draw randomly your samples. In random numbers method, you will use the table of random numbers. This is what the table of random numbers look alike. You will use this together with your sampling frame. Click the link below to watch the video on how to use the table of random numbers. For example, we have this set of emoticons which represent the population. The population identified uniquely by number. Say for example, you use the blind draw method and you have selected these emoticons as your samples. Then you have now your samples. The second probability sampling method is the systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is very similar to simple random sampling, except instead of selecting random numbers from tables, you move through the sample from picking every nth name. In systematic sampling, there is a system in selecting your samples. Click the link below to watch the video on how to use systematic sampling technique. The third probability sampling method is the stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is a modification of simple random sampling and systematic sampling. It is also designed to produce a more representative and thus more accurate sample. In stratified sampling, population is divided into groups. You will select your samples from each stratum or subgroup of a population. It is also used when the population is heterogeneous, where certain homogeneous subpopulations can be isolated. In stratified sampling, the distribution is expected to be skewed. Say for example, we have this population. The population is divided into two groups, or two subgroups or strata. Group 1 has more population than Group 2. It is expected that we have
greater sample size in Group 1 than Group 2, so that all strata are well represented. Say for example, you have selected your samples for each stratum. You have now your resulting sample. Take note that every member of each stratum in the population has an equal chance of being selected into the sample. The last probability sampling method that will be discussed in this lesson is the cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, the entire population is divided into groups or clusters, and a random sample of these clusters are selected. All observations in the selected clusters will be part or included in your sample. It is also used when a random sample would have a list of target subjects that are widely scattered, in that surveying them is more expensive. It is used when you cannot get a complete list of the members of a population, but you can get a complete list of the clusters of your population. This method is more practical than the simple random sampling or the stratified sampling method. Say for example, your population is divided into 5 clusters, and you have selected cluster B and cluster E as your cluster samples. You will now have your resulting sample. Take note that every cluster in the population has an equal chance of being selected into the sample, and every cluster member has an equal chance of being selected from that cluster. We will now discuss non-probability sampling method. One of these methods is the purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is a method where the participants are selected by the researcher subjectively. The researcher will pick a sample that he or she believes is representative to the population of interest. Respondents are not selected randomly, but by using the judgment of the interviewers or the researcher. Take note that in non-probability sampling method, your statistical tool is limited. Quota sampling is also a non-probability sampling method. In this method, researcher creates a sample involving individuals that represent a population. It is also a method where data is selected or collected from homogeneous group. Another non-probability sampling method is the convenience sampling. In convenience sampling, it is often used when you have a face-to-face interview. It is used when the interviewer simply stops anyone in the street or knocks on doors, asking anyone to participate and interviewing anyone willing to help. In other words, sample is selected from a group of people easy to contact or easy to reach. Another non-probability sampling method is the snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is often used when trying to interview hard-to-reach groups. You initially contact a few potential respondents, interview them, and then ask if they know of anybody else with the same characteristics you are looking for. And the last non-probability sampling method that will be discussed is the self-selection sampling. In self-selection sampling, respondents themselves decide whether to take part in the survey or not. That ends our lesson 1.2. Subscribe to my channel for more updates on our lesson.